1 Corinthians chapter 10. All right, let's start off with some questions. Here's a question. What is sinful music? How about this one? How much time should a Christian spend between work and home and church? How about this one? What's the proper diet for a Christian? What is proper clothing for a Christian? What's proper dating standards? Christian dating standards. What are proper magazines, TV shows, movies for Christians? What are proper cars to buy, houses to buy, friends to make, jobs to have, vacations to take, sports to play, purchases to make for Christians? These are all issues we've heard before, and they all have one thing in common. Christians disagree about the answers, don't they? You get a room full of Christians, you're going to have all sorts of different answers to this. The Bible gives us black and white, clear answers on many things. It's always wrong to murder. It's always wrong to lie. It's always wrong to get drunk. But there are other issues that the Bible doesn't speak to specifically that isn't absolutely clear. Like, is this good music or is that bad music? Is this a good TV show or is that a bad TV show? So when it comes to that, the Bible gives us principles to follow. And these principles cover everything, like always be godly, always be holy. Those principles cover every question we can possibly answer or ask in life. Answer all those questions. The problem comes when Christians get together to apply those principles, we often disagree with each other. You know, you can't be holy and listen to rap music, some will say. Other people say, absolutely, there's some rap music that is perfectly holy. And on it goes as Christians try to figure these things out. And who's right? Christians can't agree. And that has led to an enormous amount of trouble in the church over the years as we've tried to get along throughout the centuries. Questions like these tend to really trap Christians into a lot of trouble. This morning we're going to look at the subject of God's guidelines for freedom choices. Freedom choices. And that's what these are. All of these are freedom choices that you and I get to make choices about. This afternoon, this coming week, you will make choices about all these different areas. And you're free to do that. The Bible gives you freedom to do that. But there are guidelines that we need to follow. And you say, well, why do I need to have guidelines for freedom choices? And the whole point is that I'm free to make them. Right? You're free. Well, think about this. Are you free to drive your car? If you have a driver's license, you're free to drive your car. You can take off, go down the road, go this way, that way, do what you like. But you're not free to drive on the left side of the road. You're not free to break all the speed limits. You're not free to ignore traffic signs. With that freedom, there have to be guidelines, or otherwise you're going to do something very dangerous and cause a lot of trouble with your car. You've got to follow guidelines to make your freedom work right. And in the same way, we have freedom in all these things here. But unless we follow guidelines to direct those freedoms in the right places we can, and it has been done, a lot of trouble has been caused over freedom issues like this. So this morning, think about yourself this afternoon and maybe making decisions in some of these areas. Do you know the guidelines that God gives you to make decisions that one day when you're held accountable by Him face to face, you're going to be able to say, I followed those guidelines. Do you know the guidelines? And are you following those guidelines? That's what we're looking at today. God's 3 guidelines for how to make freedom decisions. The first guideline is found in front of us here in chapter 10, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23. Follow along as I read 10:23. It says, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. All right. Here we find the first principle that God lets us here know about freedom guidelines. He starts off with saying twice, all things are lawful, all things are lawful. What is Paul saying there? Is Paul saying murder is now lawful? Getting drunk now is lawful? No. We're talking about freedom issues. That's what he's saying. And he's referring to the fact that Old Testament Christians had a whole bunch of forbidden regulations they had to follow. They couldn't work on Saturdays. They couldn't eat pork. They had to dress certain ways, and there were lots of things that were very restrictive under the old covenant God made with Israel. But now that the new covenant has come, and we celebrated that last week, the new covenant in my blood through communion, Jesus started a new covenant with new rules. Many of them are similar. Many make things that were previously unlawful lawful now. We can eat pork. The followers of God can work on Saturdays. And a lot of these things now that were formerly unlawful are now lawful. That's what Paul is saying here. Paul is saying there are so many things now that are lawful. It's really great. But, he says, that's not the only consideration when you come down to freedom issues. And as a for instance, he's been speaking about this whole issue of eating pork, eating idol's meat. As a way of review, if you remember, we've gone through 3 chapters on the subject of eating idol's meat. In chapter 8, he says, look, you can eat idol's meat, but don't do it if it's going to hurt other people. In chapter 10, he says, I myself have denied myself many things to not hurt other people. In chapter 10, he says, Israel didn't deny themselves many things, and it got them in terrible trouble. God laid them low in the desert for it. So Paul's already addressed this issue of eating idol's meat in an idol's temple. This is bad to do. He hasn't addressed the subject, though, of whether or not they had freedom to eat idol's meat in their private homes. They said, look, as long as it's in public, don't do it because of the weaker Christians around you, because it's communing with demons. But what about eating that meat in your own home? And he goes on to talk about that. Look at verse 23. He says, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. And here's his point here up on the screen. Not all freedom choices are profitable. He says they're not always helpful. And not all freedom choices edify. That is, they don't necessarily build up. So yes, you're free to eat idol's meat, but you got to consider what are the consequences of doing that freedom. We have freedoms we can do, but do they build up? And do they profit us? Take a Pop-Tart. Are you free to eat a Pop-Tart? Sure you are. Yeah, you can eat a Pop-Tart. But is it helpful? Is it profitable? Does it build you up? Probably not. If you don't believe me, eat Pop-Tarts all week long and then come talk to me next Sunday. You won't feel good. It's not profitable. It's not helpful. It doesn't build you up. And that is what God is saying our freedom choices must do. Yes, there's a whole bunch of lawful things you can do. It's okay. God says, yes, you're free to do that. But what effect is it having upon you? And that's the first freedom choice here. Very first thing that God says about freedom choices is God's guideline for freedom choices, they must benefit you. Okay? They must build you up. They must profit you. They must help your life. All right? That is what God is saying here. 1 Corinthians 6:12 gives a good example of this. Back in that chapter it said, all things are lawful for me, same expression. It says, but I will not be mastered by anything. Not be mastered by anything. Are we free to play sports? Are we free to buy clothes? Are we free to use our smartphones? Yes, absolutely free. You can do all those things. But some of those things can master us. A person can get so involved in sport, that's all they think about, that's all they do, that's all they spend their money on. A person can go out to the mall and buy all sorts of clothes and spend money they really shouldn't because they just got to have the latest clothes. And we all know the addiction that a smartphone can have and how you just can't put it down and it's in your hand all the time and you've got to be checking up on the latest status of whoever is going on. The Bible says, yes, you are free to do many things, but once they master you, it's no longer helpful. It's no longer profitable. Because you're only supposed to have one master, right? The one who bought us with his own blood. He's supposed to be the master of our lives, not some freedom choice that we have. Considering a freedom choice, how do you know if it's mastered you or not? How do you know if it's out of control in your life? Answer this question. Can you walk away from it? Can you walk away from that sports activity? Can you walk away from shopping and not doing it, the clothes that you've been buying? Can you walk away from your smartphone and not be addicted to it? Can you put it down? See, these things in themselves are proper and right, but once they master us, we're no longer in charge. They're in charge. and that proper thing becomes improper. God is saying that the freedom choices we have, you can make them, no problem, but they must benefit you. Because what is the goal of a freedom choice? The goal of a freedom choice isn't to just please yourself. The goal is to benefit yourself. You've got to make choices that help you. So looking at these areas, are there any of these that are not in control in your life, that are not benefiting your life? God says then you're not free to make those choices. Some people may be able to make these choices, no problem at all. If you are not able to control it, if it is not helping you and benefiting you and making things better for you, then you're not free to do that. First thing that God tells us about freedom choices, including idols meat or anything up here on the screen, is it's got to benefit our lives. That's God's first guideline. God's second guideline is found in verse 24. Look at that, verse 24. It says, "Let no one seek his own good," and it means only, "but that of his neighbor." Let no one seek his own good, but that of his neighbor. Paul has just said, when you make a freedom choice, it's got to be a benefit to you. But not just a benefit to you, it's got to be a benefit to other people. And that's the second thing. God's guideline for freedom choices is that it must not just benefit you, it must benefit others as well. All the choices you make are to be made in the light of, is this going to benefit other people? Or is this going to tear down other people? Paul had already addressed the subject of the idol's meat in public. Now he goes on to address eating the idol's meat in private. Look at verse 25. 10:25, it says, "Eat anything that is sold in the meat market without asking questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all it contains." So Paul is saying, eating idol's meat in an idol's temple, in public, don't do that. Because weaker Christians can see you and be hurt by it. It is also communing with demons. Remember, we talked about that. Don't do it if it's going to take place in a temple. Now he says, as far as in your own home, if you're going to the meat market and there's idol's meat that is on sale, it has been used previously in the temple and now it's being sold in the meat market, go ahead and buy it. Go ahead and eat it at home. Go ahead and enjoy it. That's okay to do. That's what God says. In other words, that temple experience where it was communing with demons does not stay with the meat once it's put into a meat market. It's not a permanent contamination that goes on there. God says, just eat. Why? All food is from God. And all Christians in the New Testament can eat anything they want. God says it's perfectly fine. And even if you go to a house of an unbeliever and he serves you idol's meat, it's in private. Don't worry about it. Go ahead and do it. Look at verse 27. It says, "If one of the unbelievers invites you and you want to go, eat anything that is set before you without asking questions for conscience sake." Paul's saying idol's meat in private is not an issue with God. Don't worry about it. The host sets it down before you. Don't ask questions. Where was this meat? He says it's not a big deal to God. You don't have to make it a big deal about yourself. Just go ahead and enjoy it. That's what he's saying about this idol's meat in private. However, he puts a qualification here. He says, what if there is a Christian at that man's house who happens to have convictions that idol's meat is wrong? What do you do? Do you kick him under the table and say, stop being, this way? Look at what verse 28 says. "But if anyone says to you, 'This meat is sacrificed to idols,' do not eat it. For the sake of the one who informed you, and for conscience sake, I mean not for your own conscience, but the other man's conscience." So if a weaker Christian who feels that this meat is polluted, is sinful, which it's not, but he believes it is, if he warns you, this is for idols, what are you supposed to do? You don't roll your eyes. You don't say, come on, just grow up and eat this meat. The host is going to be offended if you don't. No, he said, side with your weaker brother. Because what's the goal? The goal is to benefit others with your freedom choices. Yes, you could put your head down and say, come on, just get over it and dig into that steak. But that would hurt your weaker brother. The second goal of all the freedom choices we have is not only must benefit me, build me up, but it also must build up others and not hurt them. You say, well, what about the host? You can imagine he sits this steak down in front of you and say, I can't eat that. Wouldn't that hurt his feelings? Paul's saying here, it is better to offend your host than it is to hurt the conscience of that weaker brother. It's better to do that. His conscience and not being hurt is extremely important. So make sure you don't violate that. For one, the host, it probably wouldn't be good for him to see you two fighting over whether or not we can eat this meat. So don't fight about it. Number two, when someone sees another person siding with a person's convictions and seeking to help them along because they struggle with something, that's something people often respect, even if they don't disagree with it. They see you standing with someone who's struggling, and that can cause even respect to be given to you. So God says, the host or the weaker brother who's tempted to, who's being hurt by what you did, side with the weaker brother who is being hurt, and don't eat the meat. And all that is to say, the second principle here is that we have to take seriously the fact that our freedom choices must not hurt other people. Paul knew this would be hard for Christians to hear. You mean I have to give up a perfectly good steak? And he anticipates their objection in verse 30. In verse 30 he says, if I partake with thankfulness, why am I slandered concerning that for which I give thanks? In other words, Paul is saying, why can't I enjoy this food when I'm really thankful to have it? The steak looks really good. I want to dig into it right here. Why can't I do that? And Paul's saying again, because of the goal. The goal of all freedom choices, not just to help yourself, which you must do, but you also must help other people through it. And if it's tearing down other people, if it's offending other people, if it's hurting other people's conscience, you give it up. You be the mature one. You be the mature one. And put them first. Look at verse 32. He says, give no offense, either to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. That covers everybody. The Jews, the Greeks are the Gentiles, unbelievers, and the church of God is all Christians. He says your goal is to give no offense in your freedom choices. Now again, not in black and white, clear-cut choices where you say, I'm not going to lie for you, and that offends somebody. No, then they'll have to be offended. But in your freedom choices, the goal is don't offend anybody. And then Paul gives an example in verse 33. He says, this is what I do, just as I also please all men in all things, seeking not my own profit, but the profit of the many, so that they may be saved. Paul says, when it comes to my work with evangelism, I do everything I can in freedom choices to please other people. Now, he made enemies everywhere he went, but that's because he stuck to the clear-cut, black and white commands of God. But when it came to freedom choices, he would always side to make sure that the choices he was making was not offending, was not hurting other people, but was gaining their profit. He says, I'm not seeking my profit in these freedom choices. Other people are the reasons I'm making my freedom choices. This is what God calls us to do. So you're driving in a car with a bunch of friends and you're listening to some music and you're all enjoying yourself, and you look over and you see one of the friends isn't enjoying himself as much as others. You see he looks upset, and you ask him, you say, what's wrong? He says, I know this is a catchy song and all, but this band has some really some ungodly people and done some pretty wicked things in their personal lives. It just bothers me. What are you going to do? You can say, oh, please, would you just grow up? It's just a song. It's no big deal. You're taking this way too far. You're really overly sensitive about this. Yes, you could say that. But God says, this is a weaker Christian. He's struggling with something that he shouldn't be struggling with necessarily, at least in your mind. What are you going to do? God says, the second goal of our freedom choices is to benefit others, not wound others, not hurt or offend others. So just say, you know what, we can find another song and change it. That's all you got to do. But it requires self-sacrifice, and that's hard to do, especially when you don't think it's needed to be done. But God says that is the second way that you must make freedom choices. So think about this list again up here. Are any of the choices you're making in these areas hurting someone else, offending someone else? I mean, you can't please all people all the time. But if you're in public and you're doing some of these things and you know that it's causing another person distress or trouble or harm, what does God say to do? Give it up. Your goal is to make other people be benefited from your choices about freedom issues? Is there anything you need to change that might be hurting another person? God says, you be the mature one and change your ways for them, for their benefit. So God's guidelines for freedom choices are, first, it's got to benefit me, then it's got to benefit others. And verse 31 gives us the third group we have to look out for. Verse 31, whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. So the third guideline that God gives us is it must benefit God. Our freedom choices, they must benefit God. See, Paul now kind of brings up this 3-chapter discussion to its absolute conclusion. He wraps it up. He says, look, I'm not just talking now about idols meat. I'm saying whatever you eat. And not only whatever you eat, whatever you drink. And not only whatever you drink, but whatever you do. So this covers everything possible in life. All the freedom choices that you can possibly make. He says you must do it to the glory of God. The glory of God. What does that word mean? We don't talk that way in everyday language. We don't talk about glorifying things or people, or that isn't a normal word that we use. What does it mean to glorify God? I bet if I got 10 of you up here, I get 10 different answers what it means to glorify God. That word to glorify, you know what that word means? I'll show you what it means. That word glorify means this. It means to turn a spotlight on something and make it bright. Okay? That's what the word glorify means. To make something else bright. So you have a man escaping from prison at night, and what do? Turn the spotlight on his bad deeds. Okay? We have a performer on stage. What do? Turn a spotlight on him so he can be seen and his performance enjoyed. God says, I want you to do that with me. And all you do, I want you to turn the spotlight on me and show people my excellence. That's what it means to glorify God. To brighten him up with your life. Him, not myself, him up and show how excellent he is. The first verse that comes to my mind is Psalm 19:1. The heavens declare the glory, the brightness of God, the brilliance and excellence of God, and the skies show his handiwork. So you go out on a beautiful starry night and you look up at the stars, and what are they doing? They're turning their work, their lives, to spotlight on how great and excellent and powerful and wonderful God is. So that when we look at them, we think about him and how great he is. That's what the stars do. And God says, I want you to be like the stars. I want people to see the way you eat. And I want to see the way you drink. And I want people to see the way you do whatever you do and think highly of me. That's what God says he wants us to do. That's what it means for us to glorify, make bright God. There are many ways the Bible says we can do this. In John 14, it says, whatever you ask in my name, that will I do, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. So Jesus is saying, when you pray to me, you turn a spotlight on me and God. Because you're saying you are worthy of prayer. You are faithful. You are great and powerful. That's what our prayers say about him. And God says, when you pray, you turn the spotlight and make me look excellent. John 15:8 says, my Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit. So when you go out later on today and you help someone who has dropped their groceries, or you compliment someone for something that they did, you give a cup of cold water to someone who's thirsty, what you've just done is you've turned the spotlight on how excellent God is, because he's the one who motivated and loves those types of things. You glorified God, turning the spotlight on his excellence. And then it says in 1 Peter 4:16, if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be ashamed, but he is to glorify God in this name. There it is. Being mistreated as a Christian comes with all sorts of hardships. But God says in the way you respond to others who might treat you badly because you're doing what's right, who lie about you, who treat you cruelly because you're standing up as a Christian, Let your behavior shine on God's excellence. Let them see behavior that will show how great God is. Don't let them see you backing down or cowering with fear or giving in to sin. Turn the spotlight on God and show how excellent He is by being faithful to Him, showing how faithful He is to you. That's how you glorify God. And God is saying in these verses, not just to do it with these large areas of life, but do it with the little areas of life, like eating and drinking. Eat in such a way that people are being impressed with God's excellence. And drink in such a way that they're going to be impressed with God's excellence. But we all know, in the areas like this, we can do each one of these things in ways that don't show any excellence of God at all. That we can do them in ways that are bad and self-centered. We can eat in a self-centered way. And the example from this chapter is you have a steak put down before you, that Christian across the table from you, you know his conviction is that that's wrong, and that eating that steak is sin. And you say, you know what? I don't care about his convictions. He's overly sensitive anyway. I'm just going to eat this steak. And you dig in. That's not shining. You're eating upon the excellence of God, because God would never support that. Or it says in how you drink, do it to the glory of God. And so maybe you're sitting down at a table with someone that you know has a conviction that all alcohol is wrong and that a Christian should never drink alcohol, and you don't happen to feel that way, and you have a glass of wine in front of you, and you don't care about them. And you say, they're just being overly sensitive. I have total freedom to do this. And you drink that alcohol, it offends and wounds them, and you've not shown a bright spotlight on God's excellence. Because God would never want you to hurt another Christian based upon a freedom issue. Whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, God says the goal must be third goal is to benefit God through it. God gets a benefit out of it. Somehow God is made bigger and brighter because of the choices that you are making in these areas of freedom issues. In the area of music, what is good music? How do we know the right music to take? You ask yourself, will these songs turn attention on spotlight God and His ways, or do they turn attention away from God and His ways? And there are some songs that clearly turn attention to God and His ways. They're just the songs we've sung today. Sing about Him, honor Him, lift Him up, spotlighting His excellence. Beautiful songs. There are songs that we can all think of that totally do not, in any way, put a spotlight on God and His ways. It's just totally off. And God says those are not freedom choices that you should be making because they don't glorify me. There are songs in the middle that, you can't say, well, that they really don't talk about God, but they're not really bad either. As long as they are promoting beauty and good things, that's in God's corner. And that's something God would approve of. That's how you would apply this to music. Same thing goes for what TV shows to watch, what movies to watch, what internet sites to go to, what books to read, magazines to read. Do these things that you're considering shine a bright spotlight on God and His ways, or do they turn off of God in His ways? That's what we have to ask. We can all think of TV shows and movies that definitely do not shine on God and His ways, especially this time of year with the Halloween emphasis. So much stuff is just on what is evil, what is wrong. We want to make sure that we're spotlighting on God and His ways and things that He would approve of. And you're saying, Pastor, does that mean every movie I watch and TV show I watch has got to be rated G? There are some Christians who believe that, and that's their conviction. I don't personally think that that's what this requires. The Bible itself is filled with all sorts of evil activities, isn't it? It explains and talks about murders and rapes and child sacrifice and cannibalism and all sorts of really shocking, horrible, evil things. That content is there in the Bible. But what does the spotlight of the Bible do with those things? It shines it on God and His ways and says that those activities are evil and they're wrong. And in no way does God promote them. In fact, God has come to this world to save us from horrible, sinful activities like that. So that's why those things can be in the Bible and still be something that is worthy of God, because it's against those things. And so there are television shows that have evil content in them, but they can turn the spotlight on those things and celebrate them, as many do, and that would never be something that would honor God. Or the characters in that show can fight against those evil things, seek to expose them, seek to have justice put upon those things. And that would be putting a spotlight on God and his ways regarding those evil things. So no, God doesn't, in my opinion, say that everything's got to be G-rated in the life of a Christian. It depends on where the direction of that television show, music, movie shines its spotlight. If it is on God and his ways while it has evil content, then that still fulfills this responsibility to make sure that all of our freedom choices are things that glorify God. God says, choose the things that glorify me. So, let's wrap this up about freedom choices. Of all the different issues up here, and maybe some that aren't up here, can you think where you're making bad choices in any of these areas? Number one, in these areas, are any of these areas that are pulling you down because you're lost control of them, or you're using them in a way that's not really benefiting your life? And God says you need to make a change. You may need to permanently get rid of this thing from your life. Or you may need to step back from it for a while until you are able to control it. It's got to benefit your life. If it's not benefiting you, God says you don't have the freedom to choose that right now. Number two, is it benefiting others? Or is it injuring and hurting others through your choices in these areas? God says none of these areas are worth hurting another Christian about. You back off and be the mature one. Pray for them to grow if they are truly immature and not responding in the freedom that God has given them. But you don't be a source of causing them to trip and to stumble on their road to the kingdom of God, because you won't pull back on an area of freedom that you need to for their sake. And then number three, are you benefiting God or are you hurting God in one of these areas? Any one of these that would be higher than God in importance of your life, of course, has got to be gotten rid of. It cannot be in your life if it is above importance than God. Again, you may need to permanently get rid of it, or you need to just scale it back and step back and put it in its rightful place. But if there's any one of these in your life that is higher than God, you've got to get rid of it. All of our choices must shine a spotlight on how great God is. That's his command to us. You know, what if I told you, I want you to go out this week and do everything that you do to glorify me. Okay? Everybody got that? Glorify me in everything you do. Talk about me all week long. Shine a light on how excellent I am. You think it was pretty vain, right? Is God being vain when he says, I want you to do that for me? For God? Is God being vain and self-centered? Well, is it self-centered for the manufacturer of your car to say, look, you can only put unleaded fuel in this car. Don't put other fuel in it. Only unleaded. Is that vain of that? No. Because that's the only way your car's going to work right. You put other fuel in there, it's going to really limp along or not work at all. That's the way it was designed, to have unleaded fuel. That is what God is telling us here. When he says, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for my glory, because that's what you were designed to do. That's how your life works. If you do anything else, your life doesn't work right. That's what's wrong with the world, right? That was the temptation to Adam and Eve. Shine the light on yourself and do what you want to do. Don't put God first. Don't do it to benefit God. Do it to benefit yourself. You'll become wise. You'll become like God. And we've gone all the way down through history. That's why the world's in the problems that it is. We've stopped living out the reason for our creation. We are to be like the stars. When people look at the stars, they're impressed with God. When people look at me, when people look at you, they're supposed to be impressed with God and what God has done in your life. And they should see that in the big things and in the little things like eating and drinking, to be impressed with God by the way you live. I think we all need to make sure that's an important part of our lives. It's easy to forget that and just walk around and not be conscious that other people are watching us. People are watching you. And God says, I want you to show them me as they watch you. So your homework this week is to keep in your mind that you were created to shine your life upon God's excellence. And then make choices that do that. Can you do that? I'm going to seek to do that. Let's all seek to do that. To be faithful to making sure all our choices make God look good. That's our job. All right.